We're in the root cellar, or the sauna.
Or the serial killer's lair.
I think that's what this might be.
We should pan it around. This is sort of like the Blair Witch Project.
I don't think you can really see anything, you know.
Which is probably for the best, since, you know, there might
Jed,
be bodies.
why did you bring Liz Hand here?
Wait a second, this was your idea. But we brought her here to ask her some questions about her new novel, Generation Loss.
Ooh. And what happens to me if I don't answer them?
I think we know how this goes with the blonde in the horror movies.
Right.
Sorry, Liz.
Don't go in the basement.
Cultural reference aside.
That's right. Well, actually, with the flashlight in our faces, I'm reminded of the Patti Smith quote at the beginning of the book. Art needs light. Look at the lack of it. And maybe we could start there. There's a lot of play.
Just an awesome quote.
With light.
Isn't that a great quote?
And darkness.
Yeah.
I was kind of afraid that they weren't going to give me permission for it, and then I would have had to scrap the whole book.
That was a bit lucky then, wasn't it?
Yeah, right. I paid $25 for the permission for that quote.
Oh, that's very nice.
But music is a big part of the novel.
Yeah.
And we have a lot of punk music that is referenced. Characters are talking about it, and the main character, Cass Neary, is a photographer there in the 70s punk scene in New York. So I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your relationship to the music and how that became part of the book and where that started.
Well, I grew up outside of New York City, so when I was in high school, the whole proto-punk scene in the early 70s was sort of getting going. And then by the time I went off to college or graduated from high school in 75, that was when Patti Smith's first album came out. And it was one of the, you know, I'd read about her. I had friends who had seen her in the city and friends who had seen the New York Dolls and, you know, the Velvet Underground. I was a little too young for that, but I bought the first Patti Smith album, and it literally changed my life because I had no idea that it was possible for a woman to be an artist the way that she was an artist. And, you know, growing up, and I always had wanted to be a writer, but all the women writers were like very self-destructive, or they were dependent upon men, like Anais Nin, Henry Miller, or they were, you know, Jean Rhys, or they were Dorothy Parker, they were alcoholics. There were Isadora Duncan, who was cool, but big.
So no one ever gave you Jane Austen to read?
Well, no, I didn't read Jane Austen until I was in my 20s. She was not, that was not the kind of, I was much more into reading, you know, sort of contemporary writers, 20th century writers. I mean, fantasy novels I read as well. I was very much into classic fantasy novels. But anyway, Patti Smith came along. I thought, well, wait a minute. Here's somebody who's like, you know, not screwed up and not, you know, shackled to a man and not an alcoholic or a drug addict. And even more important, she wasn't yet dead. And she wasn't that much older than me. So I kind of felt like that validated what I wanted to do with writing. And I had no musical talent, but I immediately just got absorbed into the whole music scene in New York and then in D.C., which is where I went to college.
Right. Right. Great. And so, I mean, the main character, Cass Neary, is an artist. Is a female artist, also, you know, who is kind of making her own way and you know, doing things on her own terms. I was curious about her. You know, she's also an alcoholic and a drug user and kind of a kleptomaniac, and so she's constantly surprising us with the things that she does.
The terrible things that she does.
I was wondering if she ever even...
She hits new lows with every page.
Can't believe it. So did she ever surprise you while you were writing the book? Were there things that just kind of came about, like, oh, Cass, no.
I mean...
oh, Cass.
No, Cass, no. Don't stop.
Right.
I don't know. You know, she did some of the just sort of messed up minor stuff that she did, like with the, you know,
stealing the guy's keys,
stuff like that, which is stuff that I would never in a million years do.
You're just messing with someone just to mess with them.
Messing with somebody's head. The little things like that, the bigger screwed up things that she did, I think were kind of easier for me to relate to, you know, for somebody doing and acting out in that way. But just to do this kind of like real low-level stuff to just like fuck with somebody's head, taking somebody's keys, moving something around, doing stuff like that. Yeah, that stuff kind of surprised me. I found her alarmingly easy to channel.
I also want to ask about photography in the book, because I'm fascinated by photography. And many of the main characters here have their own photographic projects, and they really have a lot to do with their own characters and what happens with them. So I was wondering about how you came up with those photographic projects, whether you're a photographer and have done work like that, or if those were, just how those ideas came about, like Cassinieri's Dead Girls, or the works that the photographer who she's going to interview, the ones that she's done.
Well, I love photography, but I have never been able to really do it well. But I have a lot of photo books, like kind of collect Cindy Sherman and Robert Mapplethorpe and Jill Peter Wicken and people like that. But I did, when I worked at the Smithsonian, spent a lot of time working in their photo lab at the Air and Space Museum. So I kind of learned just enough to be dangerous, and I did learn how to develop film and process it and stuff like that. But I had tragically I had no real talent. But I was fascinated by it, and the whole process. I love to write about artists and describing what they do. I mean, writing is a very boring thing to describe doing, but like any kind of a visual art, photography or painting or something, that anything where people get their hands dirty, which I don't think you do so much with digital photography. I mean, are your hands dirty there right now? No, I can see. No, they're very
from climbing down to the cellar, perhaps.
But old style photography, which fewer and fewer people engage in, it's a very physical act. And but I also liked Robert Mapplethorpe used to say that the only he didn't even, I don't even think he processed his own film. He had somebody else do it. His whole thing was that it was just his vision. He had the vision, and it was going to go from here, his brain, onto the page. And even if all of these other people worked for him to get that done, that was what was important, was what he saw here. And I was always very taken with that as sort of an artist's statement. And I put that into Cass's mouth at one point, where she says, people care about, technical finesse and everything else, but nobody gives a shit about vision. And like, all I care about is vision. 3 weeks of captivity. I promise I'll finish the revision.
All right. Well, thanks.
Oh, you're welcome.
How about that?
Thank you.
No,
Signing off from the root cellar.
From the root cellar.